Hey y'all, so today I'm going to be talking about my writing journey. To be completely honest, this is probably the most excited I've been to film a video in quite a while because it's gonna be a really awesome trip down memory lane, and I've got this giant stack of my old stories sitting next to me, and I'm just really excited about this. That being said, this is probably going to be a very long video because there is a very long writing history with me, so I'm gonna go ahead and just jump into things. So as many of you know, I've been participating in NaNoWriMo this month, and I ended up winning on day 20, and I've just been really excited about writing, and it gave me the idea to actually just make a video talking about my writing through the years, because it's been a very long journey to get to where I'm at today. So while I was home for Thanksgiving, I rummaged through my drawers and I found all of my old stories, or at least whatever I had left, and I brought them home with me, and I'm gonna be sharing them with you today. So I kind of see my writing history as having 3 different periods or 2 different periods. Essentially, I see like my early childhood, which would be kind of through maybe 4th grade or 3rd grade as one section, and then my preteen years, so maybe like 5th through the beginning of 7th grade, and then my teenage years onward through present day. So starting in my early childhood, the earliest thing that I have that is some sort of semblance of a story are these journals that I kept in kindergarten. Essentially, my mom had me journal every single day when I was in kindergarten, and mostly it's just her writing whatever the main event was for that day, but it also includes my drawings and stuff like that. And obviously this isn't exactly a story, but I definitely got started rather early with storytelling, even if it was my own day-to-day activities. One of the things that I did in these drawings was I was awful at drawing hands. They were always way too big for the person's body, and I also drew girls' hair like almost a rainbow over their head, and it was never actually attached. This one is one of my favorite entries because I got in trouble in school because apparently I took a plate of plastic watermelon and shoved it in my friend's face, and that's what I decided to draw for the day. But I love that my mom labeled plate on face. This is just hilarious for me. And then this one is another of my favorites where I was playing basketball with my friends, but I really love that I decided to get morbid and to draw blood on my friend's head where the basketball hit her, even though it didn't draw blood. I just was apparently a morbid kid, and I remember finding this really funny when I did it, and my mom was slightly disturbed. So moving on from those journals, the first story that I actually remember sitting down and writing was actually a fanfic. And not only was it a fanfic before I knew what fanfics were, it was an Arthur fanfic. Unfortunately, I don't still have the story. I don't know where it went, but I know that I wrote it, and I think there might have been 2 different stories because I keep remembering 2 different plot lines and I can't remember which one the actual story was, so I think there were 2. But the one that I have the most distinct memory of is one where Arthur and DW are a prince and princess, and they have beds that they can raise and secret passageways under their beds that go to many different places. And I don't remember what happened in that story, but I remember thinking that it was a cool idea for them to have secret passageways under their beds. And I know that I wrote that sometime in 1st grade, and I really wish that I still had it, but unfortunately I don't. And the same is kind of true for the next few years of my childhood. I don't know if I stopped writing stories or if I just didn't keep the stories, but I have no stories from the rest of 1st grade through almost 3rd grade. The only story that I still have from 3rd grade is actually one that I submitted to a school contest and where I actually won the contest, and it was, I believe, called The Cool Kids and the Doghouse Mystery. Essentially, there was a group of kids and there was something weird going on in one of their friends' dog houses. Like, apparently this dog house was actually giant inside and there was artwork, and someone was stealing the artwork. I couldn't find the actual copy that I printed out for that contest, but I did write it down in what I consider to be my magnum opus of my early childhood years, which is this little book called Just for Today, Be Happy. So this is a journal that someone gave to me at some point, and it kind of bridges the gap between my early childhood and my preteen years because I actually started writing in this sometime, I believe, in 4th grade, and I finished it, I think, like right before 5th grade. Essentially what I wanted to do with this was I wanted to fill this entire journal up with a lot of different stories, and that's what I did. I just rediscovered this blurb at the beginning of the book that I wrote as kind of like an introduction, so I'll just read it for you. Just for Today Be Happy is a book of jokes and stories. Some are mysteries, some are scary, some are pure magic. To find out the other kinds, read this book. Also, there is something that I erased that I can still read a little bit, and it says, P.S. There could be scary ones, but they end funny. So the beginning of this book is a lot of like little creepy stories that my friends and I would tell, and then there are a bunch of like really stupid knock-knock jokes that I'm pretty sure I stole from another book. And then there are a ton more really ridiculous stories. I wrote down a clip from the Scooby-Doo movie where Scooby-Doo is like dressed up in a woman's clothing and walking on two legs in the airport. And then there are a bunch more really stupid knock-knock jokes. For example, knock knock, who's there? Wet. Wet who? Wet me in, it's waning. Like, that's the caliber of joke that I put in here, and I'm pretty sure I stole all of them from other places. So then I have labeled stories, so I'm assuming this is where the stories start. So the first story in here is called The Kidnapped Vampire, and this is probably an important place to mention that I was obsessed with the movie The Little Vampire as a child, and I think that kind of influenced the story. But essentially there are 6 kids and one of them gets kidnapped, and they're all vampires, by the way, and then they go and try to rescue their friend. So then there are a bunch more really silly little stories that I'm not going to share because they're just really random and there are a ton of them. But the next most important one is The Cool Kids and the Doghouse Ghost, which is the one that I told you about earlier, and I love that I drew this little first place ribbon on there because I cut out a first place ribbon and added it to the actual physical story. So the next story in here that's pretty prominent is The Haunted House, which is actually the sequel to the first vampire story that I had earlier in the book. So essentially it's the same 6 characters, and this rich kid from their school dares them to go inside this haunted house, and she's gonna pay them each like $100 or something, and so they go inside this haunted house. After that last vampire story, I believe there's only one more story, and this is going to introduce a theme that's going to be very prevalent in my preteen works, and that is horses. This one is called Wild and Free, and in this story my main character adopts like a ton of horses, and then there are like little snippets about the horses' lives after she adopts them, and apparently they all rescue her in some crazy way. And that's the end of the book, although there is on page 160 a little about the author section, and apparently my favorite subject at the time was science, which is a shock to me because I don't think ever since then has science been my favorite subject. In fact, it is usually my least favorite subject. Anyway, that is Just for Today Be Happy, which, like I said, was kind of like my magnum opus in my early childhood years. So then we move into my preteen years, which, like I said, was maybe ages like 10 through 12, and that's when all of these stories come into play. I don't know what it was about 5th grade, but in 5th grade I turned into a story writing machine, and I just really enjoyed writing, so I have a ton of stories from this time. Many of these have similar themes, but there are a couple that are kind of like out in left field, so I'm going to share those 2 first. So the first one is possibly one of my favorites from this era, and it is entitled Kristen Bright, Helper of the College World. It's important to note that as a 10-year-old, I was obsessed with Oklahoma State University. That's where my dad went to school, and I was kind of at this point where I wanted to do everything my dad wanted to do, and like I wanted to play the saxophone because my dad thought it was cool, and I was obsessed with OSU because my dad went to OSU. So in this story, I was a college student. I believe I was 19, and I had magical abilities that would allow me to jump inside people's bodies and control them, and I used this ability to help people study and make their grades better. If that is not the most Ravenclaw thing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. But my friends and I return back to college for our sophomore year, and we get roomed with these cheerleaders that are really mean, and they put these chips on our necks that make us do girly girl things, which to me was the absolute worst thing on the planet as a 10-year-old child. I kind of want to make an entire video where I just read this story because honestly it is the most cringy thing ever. Like in this story, my college major was becoming an author because apparently I thought that that was a college major that someone could have. But other than that, the story is just hilarious to read back as a 22-year-old because it's just so dumb and there are so many misspellings and grammatical errors. It's just really hilarious and it's great to look back on. So the next story that I have is called The Color of Friendship, and yes, I did steal that name from the Disney Channel original movie. I think that I just thought that it was a really good name and I thought it fit the story, and so I decided to use it for my own story. This is also when triplets and twins begin to play a part in my stories because I was obsessed with triplets and twins and I thought they were really cool. And so in most of my preteen stories, my main character is either a triplet or a twin. This story is set in the Civil War era and it takes place at a plantation, and my main character is one of a set of triplets. Her dad is the plantation owner, and when they get a new group of slaves in to work on their plantation, Kristen, the main character, really cleverly named, becomes friends with two of the slave children and tries to help them escape. Also, most of the main characters in my stories during this time are named Kristen, Jennifer, and Adam because those were my two best friends at the time, and usually they're triplets. I'm actually going to revisit the story later in the video because it is one of the stories that I kind of want to rework into something that is actually usable and possibly publishable eventually, but obviously this story is very, very simplistic and I mean, it was a 10-year-old when I wrote it, so very, very simple and not much substance to it. However, obviously the theme is really great because my main characters wanted to help some slaves escape their slavery, so that's really cool. Next up are Sisters and Sisters 2, very cleverly named. So another thing that was really prevalent in my storytelling in this era was horses. Horses are my favorite animal, and I was obsessed with them as a 10-year-old, so every single character that I ever had a horse. In this story, my main character is Kristen, and her best friends are Jennifer and Adam, and she has an older sister who I believe is named Lucy, who is very, very girly and who tries to force her girliness upon her. If you haven't noticed, I was very much a tomboy as a child, and that was something that I really appreciated about myself, and so a lot of my stories centered around like girliness being a bad thing and being a tomboy being a good thing. Really dumb in hindsight, but it is really hilarious in this story. Essentially, when the older sister tries to force her girliness on my main character, she runs away. And then things happen and eventually they become friends again. And that is basically the plot of Sisters. And then Sisters 2 is kind of just an extension of Sisters in the fact that Lucy tries to force her girliness upon Kristen again and Kristen runs away. However, Kristen this time finds this town up on the mountain that she keeps running away to, and she starts interacting with this girl who's up on the mountain, and she discovers all these different things going on in this mountain. Still really simple and really dumb, but definitely a lot more interesting than the first Sisters story. You'll also probably begin to notice that a theme in these stories is one of my main characters running away, and that is also true in Trapped in the Forest. Very accurately titled, my main character is one of a set of triplets. Her name is Kristen, and the other two are Jennifer and Adam, and when Kristen gets upset about something that happens at home, she runs away to the forest near their house on her horse. Adam and Jennifer try to follow and find her, but when they go into the forest, suddenly this wall rises up out of nowhere, and they realize that it is completely encompassing the forest, and that they have no way to get out of this forest. But fortunately, they have a treehouse there where they stay, and they try to unravel the mysteries of the wall that has just risen in the forest. Another important thing to note is that Comic Sans was my favorite font, and I always used it in size 20. So I was clearly really, really cool. Also, I started making actual covers for these stories at this point. I'm also fairly certain that I took this story to school and had my entire 5th grade class read it. I kind of think that some of my inspiration for those stories that are kind of set in nature came from Peg Carrot, who was my favorite author at the time, a lot of her stories are kind of set not during like disasters, but in different like natural occurrences. And so a lot of her stories are set in nature, and I think that I was just kind of inspired by those stories a little bit. I don't know. So now we move into the last two stories of my preteen years, both of which centered around another major theme in this time, which was spies. Spy Kids was my favorite thing as a child. And so obviously that was a great inspiration for writing stories like USA the Princess. Once again with a snazzy cover that clearly didn't print correctly. Also this time she's named JC, which is a name I got obsessed with at this time. I think I used it as like an acronym for Jennifer Carey, but I was obsessed with that name. But there are also a Jennifer and an Adam, of course. Anyway, in the story, JC is a spy, as are her friends and her brother. They're sent on a mission to protect this princess because someone has threatened to kidnap her. And I believe that twins also come into play here, because I believe that the princess is the long lost twin of JC, and I think that she ends up getting kidnapped, and then like the head of the spy agency is actually the villain. I don't remember the full details of the story, but I do know that it's definitely a little bit more detailed than the past few stories. And now we move into what I consider to be my magnum opus of my preteen years, which is Living in a Spy's Old House. As you can see, this is completely falling apart because of the number of times that I have read this or just used this. So yeah, this was a very special story to me as a child because I wrote it in, I believe, 6th grade, and it is 50 pages long. Granted, it's 20 point in monotype Corsivia font, but who cares? It's 50 pages long. As you can probably tell from the incredibly clever title, my main character, who is again a triplet, and the other two are named Jennifer and Adam, they move into a house that they learn is a spy's old house. A spy built it a very long time ago, and so they believe that there are probably some secretive things going on in the house, like maybe some secret passages or something, who knows? So they discover these like secret rooms and these secret gadgets, and then the arch nemesis of the spy who built the house breaks into the house and kidnaps their parents, and they have to go and find the spy who is going to help them recover their parents. Anyway, at the time, I was obsessed with this story. This, for me, was the best story I'd ever written, and it probably was the best story I'd ever written, but it was definitely a little bit more complex than the last few, and I was obsessed with it. I made all my friends read it. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And then to round out this time period, I have this folder, which isn't a single story, but rather a compilation of all of the stories during this time period that I didn't finish. Essentially, sometime in junior high, I went through all of my old notebooks and I wanted to get rid of a bunch of them, but I still had stories laying around in many of them. So I went ahead and I grabbed the stories from them and compiled all of the unfinished ones into this notebook. I also went through and I gave them different like stars or pluses or minuses, saying whether or not I wanted to return to this idea, and most of them are minuses. There's one in here called Teen Stars, which is actually the predecessor to a story that I'm going to talk about in my teen years, but essentially it deals with a reality singing competition. Here's one from 2003, which is called Jessica's Story, which I believe is all about a child whose parents both die in natural disasters, and she's stuck in an orphanage. I got some really happy stories here, guys. Oh, here's one that I really enjoyed. This was one where my main characters were twins and they were princesses, and their two best guy friends were princes, but they had crushes on their best guy friends, and they were all at college together. Then there's a Kim Possible-esque story. Ooh, Avalanche, another one that deals with a natural disaster where there are two like teenage girls who are up on a mountain, and an avalanche happens and they end up falling in this crevice and they're stuck there. Also, they have horses. Another one called Running Away, where guess what happens? My main character runs away. Although I think then she reaches like her destination, like she stays with a friend and her friend gets kidnapped in front of the house. So kidnapping again. Here's another one called What You Have to Do, in which the main character is very poor and she is trying to get a job, but the job is only for guys, so she pretends to be a guy and gets the job. Also, the job is riding a horse and delivering letters for this old rich lady. I loved horses. And I also started Sisters 3, which I have no idea where I was going with that, but I gave it a little heart saying that I wanted to continue the story. I don't know. So that concludes this preteen era of my writing. Now moving on to my teenage years through present day. This is kind of the time period where I think I started writing more complex stories and stories that could eventually be fully written out and edited and become actual, like, potentially published novels. All of the stories that I've shared with you before this point are very simplistic, and they're nothing that could ever be actually published as a story, but the ones during my teenage years are ones that are more fully thought out and more potentially publishable. And of course, there are also some fanfics, which are the ones I'll start with. The first one was originally called The Girl Who Lived, and it eventually became called The Secret Lightning Scar, and it is a Harry Potter fanfic. Because of course, I love Harry Potter. If I'm gonna write a fanfic, obviously it's gonna be about Harry Potter. And this is a story that you can actually read if you want to. I will leave a link up in the cards or down in the description to my blog, where I have several chapters of the story posted. I've never fully finished it, although I do have a general outline of the way that the whole story goes, but essentially my main character is named Carrie, I believe. I haven't touched it in several years, and she is the girl who lived. In my story, my main character, Carrie, is very similar to Harry in the fact that she was born near the end of July, and a few years after Voldemort tries to kill Harry, he comes back and tries to kill Carrie because of the prophecy. And my story takes place when all of the characters return to actually complete their 7th year of schooling, and everyone thinks that Voldemort has been vanquished and gone, but Carrie knows that because she is still alive, it's not actually the case, and Voldemort is probably going to come back at some point. And I really do enjoy the story. I am not a big fan of the way that some of the stuff on my blog turned out, because I was writing it as I was publishing it, so it's not exactly as polished as I want it to be, but I do eventually want to finish the story because it's really cute. It's mostly a like contemporary romancy story more than the actual Voldemort stuff, but it's definitely going to play a factor later in the story, but I think I only got a very small chunk of the way through on my blog. Either way, this is a story that I definitely want to return to at some point. And then my other fanfic that I started in junior high is one that y'all should be very familiar with if you've been watching my NaNoWriMo vlogs, because it was the starting point for the book that I've been writing all through NaNoWriMo. And that is my Jonas Brothers fanfic, which has turned into an actual non-fanfic story, which is now called Flirting with Fame, which again is a working title that I don't really like that much, but it kind of fits. However, most of the time I actually refer to it as Joe Brosto, because that's a really easy shorthand, and that's what I have everything saved as on my computer. So if I also say Joe Brosto, that is my Flirting with Fame story. Anyway, I'll leave links up in the cards or down in the description to my videos where I talk about the gist of the story, but essentially in the early fanfic form, the Jonas Brothers move in next door to my main character because they're trying to get away from all of the craziness of Hollywood. But essentially in Flirting with Fame, my main character lives in a small town, and her best friend is obsessed with this boy band, and she keeps saying that this boy band is going to be moving to their town to get away from all of the craziness in Hollywood, and my main character, Caitlin, does not believe her until the boy band moves in next door. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with all of the relationships and stuff, because Caitlin has this major crush on her best guy friend, and she really wants absolutely nothing to do with this boy band because she hates pop music and she sees them as these really stuck up pop stars. But things start to get a little bit interesting, and I think it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy the story, and I'm so excited to actually finish it soon. Another thing that I worked on in my early teens, which was one of the things I mentioned earlier, is a rewrite of The Color of Friendship. As a kid, I actually wanted to write a sequel to my story where Kristen goes up to the north to visit the slaves that she helped to free, but instead I've kind of had this idea of turning it more into a romance story, not like a full-out romance, but like a cutesy like teenage romance. Essentially my idea is to have a similar beginning where my main character is a teen who helps to rescue the slaves from her plantation, but she actually ends up falling for one of the slaves, and since that's obviously very taboo during that time, there could be some sort of interesting conflict with that. I'm not sure if this is actually something I want to write because historical fiction isn't actually my favorite genre to read, and I don't know how much I'd actually enjoy writing a historical fiction, but it's something that I've kept in the back of my mind for several years to potentially maybe return to. My next story is one that actually started out as a very simplistic story back in my preteen era, but I've since changed, and that is either titled Make It or Break It or Twisted Twin Toxin, again with the twins. This is another one that I alluded to very briefly earlier in the video, where essentially my main characters are in a band and the band audition for a reality singing competition. And this is one of my few stories that I've considered stretching out past a single book. This one is one that I've considered being a trilogy, but essentially the first book follows their journey through the competition. This is actually a story I've been thinking about quite a lot lately, and if I decide to start on something mostly new for the next Camp NaNoWriMo or NaNoWriMo, it might be this one, because this is one that I really, really enjoy. The next story idea that I've had floating around in my head for a very long time is what I actually just referred to as Katie James, which is the main character. One theme that is very prevalent in some of my preteen stuff and in a lot of my teenage and current stuff is a character moving at the beginning of a story, because I moved a few times as a kid and it was a very, not traumatizing experience for me, but it was just a very major life event, and I think that that really influenced a lot of my writing. So in the story Katie James, my main character is a girl named Katie, and she has lived in this small town her entire life, and at the beginning of the story, her family ends up moving. Although her family doesn't move to a massive city, they do move to a slightly larger city than the one that they lived in, and now she's going to a normal-sized high school and dealing with normal high school problems that she hasn't really encountered before. And essentially the story is just her first experiences in the real world outside of this little bubble that she's lived in all of her life, and that may not always be the best or the happiest thing. So another theme that's pretty constant through my current and teenage work is that a lot of my characters are musicians, and music plays a major part in my stories, and the same is true for my next story, which is Starship. Once again, all of these titles that I'm giving you are just words that I've attached to these stories. They are in no way actual titles that I plan on using. So Starship is kind of a story told over a very long period of time. It begins when my main character is starting high school, I believe, and by the end of the story, she is a year or two out of high school. But essentially she lives in a fairly small town, and one day when she's at the mall at the record shop, she runs into this very rocker emo guy that she immediately falls for. And he's in this band, and the story just kind of follows their relationship and the band throughout the years and how that influences each other. And once again, I really enjoy the story, and it's one that I really hope to return to sometime in the near future. And then finally, I know that this video has been going on forever, but finally, the book that I consider to be my magnum opus through my teenage years through present day. It's the one that I've talked about so much on my channel. It is Braving the Elements. And this is actually a title that I kind of want to use. It's the one that I've used to refer to this story for years and years and years. But essentially, this is a young adult urban/high fantasy story that is very, very close to my heart. As someone who loves fantasy, and fantasy is my favorite genre, I find it really interesting that this is really the only fantasy story that I have actually put a large chunk of time into. All of the other stories that I mentioned from my teenage years onward have been contemporaries. Apparently, I just really enjoy writing contemporaries despite how much I love reading fantasies. But this one fantasy story that I have that has been in my mind forever is, like I said, what I consider to be my magnum opus of this time period, because I have been working on this story for so long. it has been 9 years at this point that I've been working on just this version. In its most basic form, I started this story all the way back in 6th grade, which is 11 years ago now. And because this one is so important to me and so special to me, I'm very, very hesitant to talk about the details of the story, and I have been very hesitant throughout most of my videos that I've made on the story. I've been very hesitant to talk about any sort of details, but I'll go ahead and talk about some very basic aspects of it. So I've talked in the past about how the story is told from multiple points of view. Although there are several characters that are very prominent characters, I do consider there to be kind of like one main character and one secondary character who is almost the main character. And then it's also told from a couple other points of view and the villain's point of view occasionally. So the story deals with some characters discovering special powers that they didn't know that they had, and this magical world that they didn't know existed, and this vindictive villain that they are supposed to defeat. And I think that's as much as I'm gonna say about it. I already feel like I'm divulging a lot of information about it, but that's only because I am very, very close to the story. And even though I'm not working on it right now, it is probably the one that I feel the most closely connected to during this kind of era of my writing. Honestly, for the past few years, I haven't done a ton of writing, but when I have, it's been on Braving the Elements. And it's just one that's been really, really important to me, and I have set it aside for now because I really got burnt out with the story, but I definitely intend to pick it back up and to finish it at some point. And at this point, I think it's going to be a duology. I didn't really want it to be a duology, but the more I started working on it, the more I kind of realized that the plot works a little bit better if it's a duology. So we will see, but this is definitely the story that is closest to my heart right now. So that is my writing journey. I am sure that this was a super long video, so apologies for that, but if you watched through this entire thing, thank you so much for watching. I know that this was very long. I was very long-winded. My throat is kind of sore, so I'm gonna stop talking now and I'm gonna go get something to drink. As always, links to all of my social media will be down in the description, so my blog, my Twitter, my Goodreads. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!